Good morning. Welcome. I'm Daniel Callingart, Executive Vice President of Freedom House. Thank you for coming to this launch of Freedom on the Net 2015. The internet enriches the lives of billions of people around the world, but it is also facing significant challenges. In fact, its very nature as a free and open space is hotly contested. As the internet continues to evolve rapidly, we at Freedom House think it's essential each year to take a big picture assessment of what is going on. What is the state of internet freedom, looking at the broad range of factors which affect the ability of individuals to enjoy freedom online. And as you'll hear, this report covers 65 countries with 88% of the world's internet users. This report was made possible by the generous support of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the US State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, Google, Facebook, Yahoo, and Twitter. And I'm pleased that the Internet Society has joined the supporters of this report. The analysis and conclusions, of course, are Freedom House's and Freedom House's alone. We're delighted to have Senator Brian Schatz here this morning. We applaud your leadership on internet policy and your strong support for human rights and civil liberties. I'd like to thank Google for hosting us. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you and work together in spreading the findings of this report. And I'd like to express my personal gratitude to Ross LaJeunesse, who's been a great friend of Freedom House and a strong supporter of our work. Thank you, Ross.
Thank you. Just a word of welcome. I'm really pleased to see so many friends in the audience and so many allies in the work that we do to advance a free and open internet around the world. Google is incredibly proud of our partnership with Freedom House and especially proud of our support for this report. This report, as all of you know, is an incredibly powerful tool for all of us who fight for the free and open internet all around the world. I can't tell you the number of times I've been in conversations with a government official and they reference this report. As some of you know, government officials in some of the partly free countries actively lobby on their score, and that, I think, is a very telling indication of how seriously the report is taken and how vital it is for all of us. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming one of our allies in the fight for a free and open internet. That's Senator Brian Schatz. Senator Schatz, as you know, is the ranking member on the Subcommittee on Communications Technology, Innovation, and Internet. Senator Schatz, could you say a few words first, please?
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Freedom House and Google Washington for inviting me to introduce Freedom on the Net 2015. In the last decade alone, the number of individuals connecting to the internet grew from just over 1 billion in 2005 to more than 3 billion today, with most new users connecting from developing countries. And while internet use is on the rise, so too is censorship and political surveillance. Perhaps we shouldn't be too surprised. For authoritarian governments, access to new communications technologies has always aroused the fear that people will break their shackles, that the free flow of ideas will force the hand of autocratic governments to be more democratic. And that's why you have governments from Tehran to Beijing limiting access, and countries like North Korea walling off completely from the internet. And as the Freedom on the Net report found, more governments are now pressuring individuals and companies, including American companies, to remove content, as opposed to simply blocking or filtering websites. We are certainly making a bet that they have something to fear, that access to a free and open internet will sow the seeds of democracy by giving a voice to those seeking liberal reform. Whether or not access to an open and free internet will transform autocratic governments, it's a complicated answer, and it remains to be seen. But it is a bet worth making and one that is consistent with our values, that people everywhere ought to enjoy freedoms of expression, assembly, and association online and offline. Particularly since the Snowden revelations, some might challenge America's support for an open and free internet. But we have to distinguish between government-sanctioned surveillance programs for national security purposes within a transparent and accountable legal framework and monitoring solely for the purposes of political intimidation and repression, which all democracies should abhor. The conversation about surveillance for national security purposes has become too polarized, with hawks on one side calling for the vacuuming up of all the information we can get, and privacy purists opposed to any form of data collection. Let's not be lured into the false choice between security and privacy. There is a pragmatic center. Government surveillance can coexist with the right to privacy when it is rooted in and adheres to certain principles like transparency, the rule of law, and due process. It is when we shortcut the rule of law and due process, when our practices are cloaked in secrecy, that we find ourselves at odds with these principles and give legitimacy to the autocratic governments that use repressive tactics in the name of national security. We have to do more work at home to make sure the distinction between what all democratically elected governments do and what repressive governments do is clear, and we have to remain vigilant. That's why it's so important that we have organizations like Freedom House put out studies such as Freedom on the Net and help hold governments accountable for their actions, shedding light on those governments that would otherwise operate in the shadows, using repressive tactics to silence online dissent, block digital assembly, and other freedoms that should be protected online just as they are offline. We have a moral and practical imperative to continue to promote a free and open internet by supporting efforts that tilt the balance in favor of those who will use the internet to promote tolerance and free expression away from those who continue to use it for repression and for violence. I want to thank Freedom House, I want to thank Google, and I want to thank all of you for devoting your professional lives to this cause. These are complicated questions. Before we got started, we were talking about the physical location of data and how that intersects with privacy statutes. And these are really deeply complicated policy questions, they are moral questions, they are political questions, and they are technical questions. And all I can assure you is that I'm diving into them, and I want to work with all of you to ensure internet freedom going forward, not just in the United States, but internationally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator. We will turn to a presentation of the main findings of the report by Sonia Kelly, who's the project director of Freedom on the Net, and after that, we will go into a panel discussion. Sonia?
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. Unfortunately, this year, the news again is negative. Out of 65 countries that we assessed over the past 12 months, 32 have experienced overall declines since June of 2014. I'm going to guide you briefly through this presentation by presenting some of the major trends that we have observed over the past year, and also by highlighting a couple of emerging issues as well. Before I do that, though, I think it's going to be very helpful to get a better sense of the global internet users, who they are, where they are, and in what kind of environment do they live. As many of you know, Freedom House, in addition to producing reports on each of these countries, we grade them based on their policies and performances relevant to internet freedom. And then we group them in major categories: free, partly free, and not free. One of the more startling findings for this year is that more people now live in not free countries than in free countries. particularly concerning internet freedom. Not free countries are countries that are typically characterized by quite heavy blocking and filtering, takedown requests, arrests of users for information that they post online, and in many cases, cyber attacks also against government critics. When we looked at different statistics that we produced based on our information of global internet users, it was quite shocking to see that 61% of all internet users live in countries where criticism of the government, military, or ruling family has been subject to censorship. Also, 47% of them live in countries where individuals were attacked or killed for their online activities since June of last year. And 58% of users live in countries where bloggers or ICT users are jailed for sharing content on political issues, social issues, human rights. And as I will highlight in just 1 second, those people are not just detained for short periods of time, but in some countries, their imprisonment can last for 10, 20 years in prison, or even a lifetime. To me, this graph is quite interesting because it really showcases distribution of global internet population. As you will see, China has currently the greatest number of internet users. And in fact, over 40% of all internet users live in 3 countries, in China, United States, and India. And we're going to hear both hear from experts on China and India. And I think that's immensely important and helpful because the influence that these 3 countries have on global stage really influence what kind of internet and what kind of usage the rest of the world might have. When we did assessment of this year, we did something new. We looked at the 65 countries in our study, and then we looked at the topics that are most commonly censored. And again, surprisingly, in 47 out of 65 countries, we found examples of criticism of authorities being blocked or filtered or being removed. We also saw that many countries were censoring news on conflict or even news on corruption. Also, political opposition in many of these settings really has a hard time posting their content on digital media or risk being blocked. To me, a very almost funny finding was that governments are becoming less and less tolerant of humor. So we're seeing satire being increasingly blocked as well. And not just satire in written word, but actually images, because it seems like images are more easily shared and they go more viral, and that's what many of these governments tend to fear the most. I'm going to show you the image that was most censored on Sina Weibo, the Chinese social network, in September. And it's the image of Winnie the Pooh, and just because this image resembled the real-life image of the Chinese president in Motor Parade. And in fact, this is not the first time that Winnie the Pooh was censored in China. In fact, it all started with this image back in 2013. So I think you can see the resemblance. Although many countries turn to blocking and filtering as their main method of censoring content, one thing that we have recorded this year, and this is quite different than in the past, is that for the first time in our study, more governments are now pressuring companies and individuals to remove content as opposed to simply blocking. And there are a few reasons that might drive this trend. One is that requests are now often rooted in local laws. What we have seen in recent years is that countries have been passing a flurry of laws criminalizing different types of speech. And now with those laws on books, they're turning to individuals and threatening them, or they're going to companies and saying, well, you know, it's based in our local laws that this content is illegal, so therefore you should take it down. Another reason might be that blocking is less effective. We're seeing in many authoritarian countries users becoming very innovative, using VPNs and different circumvention tools, and really bypassing government censors. So many of these governments are then going now to companies and individuals. They're going closer to source, trying to restrict disinformation. When I talk about companies, the ones that are mostly affected are actually local companies. So there are companies on the ground who have infrastructure there, who have employees there. So very often they they use very little scrutiny in evaluating these requests. And very often they face very serious consequences if they try to refuse. But with that said, even international and American companies such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, and others face many of these requests. I think what makes their situation different is that they can actually scrutinize the nature of these requests, and they very often can not comply. And in fact, many of them produce transparency reports, which have been very helpful to us in producing our own study. We're also seeing greater coercion of individuals. And among the people that we have talked to in many of these settings, there are situations where literally the police would come to your door with a gun in their hand, and they would ask individuals to delete their blog posts, to delete their Twitter feeds, because that seems to be the most old-fashioned way of doing things in settings where local police enforcement is not very technically sophisticated. This is the screenshot that I just took yesterday, and it's a screenshot from a Twitter feed of a Bahraini satiricist. He had about 100,000 posts, some of which were critical of the Bahraini government. He was arrested, and the first thing that they did was they made him delete all 100,000 of his posts. When I took this screenshot, only one post was left remaining, which is, "They tortured me in prison." Another trend that we have observed over the past year is growing surveillance. And to us, this has been something that we have been tracking for a number of years. And this is only a part of a growing trend that we have talked about over the last 3 or 4 editions. I think many people in the human rights community were quite interested to see how the world would react apart from the outrage after the NSA revelations. And unfortunately, instead of having a real reform and look at their own surveillance practices, we're actually seeing more and more governments passing new laws that give the authorities greater surveillance powers. Over the past year alone, 14 out of 65 countries in our sample have passed new surveillance laws. But if we actually look back at the 3-year period, a half of the countries in our sample have passed such laws. Even democracies such as France, Australia, UK, and Italy have beefed up their surveillance powers through legal means. So this is not just something that's applicable to worst of the worst, such as China and Vietnam and others. We are also seeing that many countries are obtaining new surveillance technologies. And this is quite worrisome because through those surveillance technologies, in many cases obtained from Western companies, these governments are then able to put the laws to use. Another trend is that more governments are now targeting encryption and anonymity. And this goes hand in hand with surveillance observations that I just spoke about a moment ago. In response to the surveillance revelations, we have seen more companies provided encrypted services and tools, and we're also seeing more users becoming concerned about these issues and using secure communications. What has been happening then in response to this is that we are seeing a flurry of proposals as well as new legislation across the world trying to limit encryption. And again, some of these new proposals or some of the new laws that were enacted over the past year are not just happening in places like China, Bahrain, and Cuba. I know that in our own country here, we have had some discussions about whether the law enforcement should have backdoor access to encrypted communications. Another very interesting trend is that we're also seeing governments trying to stigmatize encryption tool for terrorists. So in places such as Turkey, Egypt, and Ethiopia, and elsewhere, people are actually left in prison just because the authorities uncover encryption on their computers. So that would be their only crime. And the authorities in these countries would say, well, you know, if you're using encryption, you must be a terrorist. What do you have to hide? This is just an example of something that was recently quite well publicized. 3 employees of Vice News, you see them here pictured. They were reporting on clashes on the Syrian-Turkish border. And they were detained because they were reporting on those clashes, but then they were left in prison. And in fact, the guy to the far left is still in prison just because his computer was encrypted. And the Turkish authorities claim that encryption is used by ISIS, so therefore somehow this guy must be connected. And finally, one of the major trends is, again, that arrests and intimidations of users are escalating. We have actually seen arrests for online communication documented in 40 out of 65 countries that we examined. And this is an increase in comparison to last year. And as I mentioned previously, in some of these countries, sentences are exceeding 20 years in prison, or they even reach lifetime in prison. And this is actually something that is different, because in the past, we were actually noticing increase in arrests. But over the past year, there has been this intensification of the punishment method for just writing about political issues or human rights. One of the interesting examples, or one of the interesting trends, is that we're seeing more and more youth affected, presumably because many of them, they're not human rights activists, they're not journalists, they just post things on Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, they think it's funny, and then they find the police knocking on their door. To me, an interesting example was in Belarus, where a teenager posted ALS ice bucket challenge to President Lukashenko. And then, of course, he found the police knocking on his door, threatening different sorts of things and asking him to take it down. What you see on the screen is just one example also of a harsh sentence being passed for political speech and satire. This is a cartoonist who was sentenced to 12 years in prison for sharing this cartoon on Facebook. The cartoon is depicting members of Iranian parliament as animals, and that was her key crime. With those major trends, I also wanted to highlight 2 emerging issues, one of them being net neutrality. In our country and also in Europe, net neutrality has been debated for a number of years, so this is not something that is new over here. However, we're seeing net neutrality debates emerging throughout the world now, and we're seeing governments passing measures both to protect and to restrict net neutrality. I think some of these conversations are coming in the context of zero rating services, and I'm sure that we're going to hear a bit about that during the Q&A and our discussion. And then finally, I'd like to mention the right to be forgotten. For some of you who may not have followed this, back in May of last year, EU Court of Justice granted individuals the right to request that search engines hide links about them if that information is no longer relevant or no longer correct. What we have seen since then is that the countries around the world have started looking at this ruling, and they have started to invoke it in their own judicial proceedings. And also in some countries, we have also seen attempts to push for similar legislation as well. What is quite worrisome to us is that many of these countries don't have protections that exist in the EU setting. So for example, in Russia, just in July of this year, they actually have passed a law, their own version of the right to be forgotten, but unlike in the EU, they actually don't have exemptions for public officials or for information that's relevant to public interests. So therefore, in the future, we will potentially see all these corrupt Russian officials making these requests, and these requests will then be based in Russian law. We have seen examples like that, or we have seen court rulings like that in 6 other EU countries. In some of them, also corrupt officials in Latin America trying to erase essentially information about them. And then finally, here is this year's map of internet freedom. This year, there is more purple than before, purple being the color of not free countries. But I have to say that I remain optimistic, because one of the things that we have also recorded in our research is that more and more countries are having emerging civil society movements trying to fight some of these negative changes. In addition, in a number of countries, particularly those that have more free institutions or the ones that have more free judiciary, we have actually seen the courts stepping in and in some cases overturning the negative laws. We have also seen an increasing partnership with the private sector, and the private sector in many cases stepping in and creating tools that are helpful to human rights activists. So for all those reasons, although the picture, again, is grim this year, I remain hopeful that the future of the internet is much brighter than it seems. Thank you very much. And I'm going to invite the panel to join me here on stage.
Well, welcome. Let me do some quick introductions. To my left, Eileen Donahoe is Director of Global Affairs at Human Rights Watch. She's a board member of Freedom House, and she previously served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Gadi Epstein is the media editor of The Economist. He moved back this summer from Beijing, from 12 years there, where he served as Beijing bureau chief for The Economist. Chinmayi Arun is research director at the Center for Communication Governance at the National Law University in Delhi, and she was the author of the India Country Report for Freedom on the Net. So you will have received this booklet, which is just the summary. The entire report is some 900 plus pages with detailed analysis on each of the 65 countries. And later in our conversation, we will be joined by the analysts from Kenya and from Ukraine via Google Hangout. And Sonia will be part of the discussion as well, of course. And we will converse for about a half hour and then invite your questions, which we will collect on note cards. Eileen, let me start with you. What strikes you most about this report's findings?
So first, let me say congratulations and thank Sonia and her team for producing a document that highlights, really significant data points that show trend lines globally online. I think it's becoming a more and more important product for the human rights movement. The three big things that I notice in this report, first and foremost, is the sense that the distinction between the online and offline space is collapsing. There's a blurring of the lines. For the people who are connected, and especially for human rights activists, activity online can often lead to physical insecurity. And as Sonia pointed out, there's many cases of activists being jailed, harassed, tortured, and killed because of online activity. And so that's the first thing I would point out. The second thing I would comment on is this increasing trend of governments turning to the private sector, tech companies, to engage in the activities of surveillance, law enforcement, and the violation of human rights. And what I was surprised at is the extent to which the private sector is accepting this burden shifting without question, feeling that there is an obligation to the governments without fully appreciating the extent to which they're participating in the violation of human rights. And I think there's something really important there for us all to think about with respect to the human rights framework, because the traditional understanding is that the primary human rights obligation is between governments and citizens. And governments have the obligation to protect human rights and not to violate. And so I think much more thinking needs to be done about the increasing role and power of the private sector. And I think it's important for everybody to be aware of Rebecca McKinnon's work in this space, ranking digital rights. It goes to the heart of this matter. And it's very, very important for everybody. Third trend I was not surprised about, and that is the expansion of mass surveillance. Here I would just want to highlight how important it is for countries like the United States that think of themselves as champions of human rights to understand their role modeling effect and the cover they give to other governments that are repressive and more authoritarian, and the extent to which that has happened. In this same vein, I think the stigmatizing and demonizing of encryption is another thing for the United States to be very worried about. And I think in the United States, the conversation in some dimensions has moved in a much more positive vein because security experts, those responsible for national security, protection of critical infrastructure, et cetera, understand that encryption is their friend. And digital security is important whether you're protecting data or financial information or people. Some, however, and we've heard very recently still, the director of the FBI, Comey, still argues that encryption is not the friend of those responsible for security. And I think that's a very dangerous line of commentary, and hope it ends.
Right. Senator Schatz talked about a middle ground on balancing security and privacy. Do you think that if encryption is accepted, that that's sort of the right place to be, or do you think we need to find a different place to end up?
So first thing there, I would ask everybody to slightly change your framing, especially people in the U.S. government, like the congressmen who want to embrace the protection of rights. I think if you frame the idea of freedom and security or security and versus privacy, there is this binary opposition that is set up. And in that kind of opposition, the privacy side of the equation will always lose. The rights side of the equation will always lose. Security is a human rights issue. Article 3 of the Universal Declaration, has the security of persons as a right, and it should not be viewed as in opposition to freedom. They are intricately related. We should be optimizing for both. I think everyone needs to understand how important privacy of communication, confidentiality is to the exercise of all human rights, especially freedom of expression, freedom of assembly and association. Very basic idea. Everybody thinks, oh, privacy, people don't care about it anymore. I think that is completely missing the trend line, but it's also missing the importance for human rights. Simple ideas. If everything you do is monitored and tracked, it will have a chilling effect on what you feel free to say, where you feel free to go, with whom you feel free to meet, what you feel free to access online. And again, for human rights activists and defenders, that loss of privacy can translate very quickly into a loss of physical security. That's a human rights issue.
Right. Gadi, you've seen in this report that China gets the lowest ratings, and you've noticed that in the last year or so, the censorship has become even more intense. Do you get a sense that let's say, from the Chinese government's perspective, is this working? Are people really shut down, or is it the government just trying to catch up with the innovation and the creativity of Chinese users?
I think from the Chinese government's perspective, they never feel like their work is done. And I think that's why they are so successful. They have worked at this for 20 years now. Their first example of China shutting down online speech was in 1996, only a year after really they had connected the country, and with only like 100,000 people online in the country. Now they have over 600 million people online. There's been the rise of social media, and they have, with every step that's taken place online in terms of advancement of expression, they have come up with tools to combat it. And they've had a coherent ideology about it from the beginning, and they've been discussing on guidance of public opinion for more than a decade. They've been jailing bloggers for also for more than a decade, since the beginning of blogging. They have a lot of practice at it. And what strikes me in looking at this report, and I also want to congratulate Freedom House and Sonia and everyone on this who worked on this report. It's an excellent report. What strikes me about this map, and I think strikes everyone, is how much purple is on there. That just shows that China is already exporting this model. You can see that many of these countries in purple on this map have gotten their equipment and their know-how from China. I was in Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, a couple of years ago when I was doing a special report on the internet in China and kind of looking at its impact abroad as a small piece of that. They had gotten their hardware from China and their know-how. They were copying the patterns of censorship of Russia, which is much easier in the stands. And you see more of them modeling themselves after Russia, but they were coming closer and closer to China technologically. And of course in Ethiopia and Southeast Asia and Egypt, you have, and I'm sure some of these other countries that I don't have as much specific knowledge of, you have them acquiring Chinese hardware and technology and know-how. And of course, China got that in the first place from the United States, which helped them set up the internet in the first place.
Right. You touched on the differences between China's approach to censorship or internet control and Russia's. Can you flesh that out a bit?
Well, China has managed, I think, in a way that is, I think Russia would probably love to have China's internet, but China has managed to develop a thriving domestic internet industry and can basically wall off whatever it likes, almost any service it likes, because it has its own very kind of vibrant internet sector with everything like Facebook, YouTube, and other forms of social media. They have their own versions of that are very deep in terms of user base. Russia is probably not quite there yet, and also there's also the language issue. China has not much penetration as much penetration of an English language internet, and they can develop their own Chinese language internet. So that partly is why it's developed that way, but it's also because of just the origins of the internet. China was an authoritarian state at the time that the internet came online there. Russia was in a much different place in the 90s. So I think Russia is sort of backfilling, whereas China had built up its infrastructure from the beginning. And this actually gets to the point of how sustainable. I mean, this is quite a high tide for filtering and censorship. And China has developed its own censorship industrial complex and its expertise over a very long period of time. But they also have a coherent ideology around it. They have a well-developed security apparatus for dealing with people offline. I wonder at how well some of these other countries will be able to continue to deal with challenges to their internet controls as technology continues to advance. China is well equipped to do that. That might be more of a challenge for these smaller authoritarian states that don't have quite as much capacity, and that could be maybe a glimmer of hope for people interested in internet freedom.
Chinmay, I'd like to ask you about some important developments in India. And this year's report highlights a Supreme Court ruling in March which struck down some provisions of the IT Act, which had resulted in arrests of several bloggers and social media users. And also, the Supreme Court has made technical blocking more transparent and strengthens protections for or protections against intermediary liability. So it seems like quite a significant ruling. Can you sort of put that into the context, the larger context of internet freedom in India? How significant was this ruling? And also, I gather there was quite a bit of activism to push for stronger legal protections, and maybe you could tell us a bit about that as well.
I'd be glad to. So this is actually a big democratic moment for those of us who work on internet policy in India. I was at a Freedom House meeting on the day on which the judgment came out. So it was interesting because we had spent the day discussing all the things that were wrong with the IT Act, and then this judgment affirmed quite a lot of the things that we were saying. It had three kinds of impact, one of which is very visible, which is the infamous 66A, which had criminalized speech in India. There were several prominent arrests that had taken place around India. And starting from this arrest of two young women in Bombay, several of these arrests had received a lot of negative publicity, which I think got the Supreme Court's attention even before the petition was filed. And the fact that it was these sympathetic cases that were portrayed in the media, I think also made it a little apparent to everyone that this is a provision that affects human rights of people that really came nowhere to committing a crime. The Supreme Court, I think that the Supreme Court had several options before it. It's usually more typical for courts to read down law than to strike it off the books. And so in that sense, it was a political statement of sorts where the Supreme Court acknowledged that the right to freedom of expression very much applies online, and that it can only be restricted under very specific circumstances, and that a law like 66A that does not respect the restricted list on in the Constitution is not going to be permitted to stay on the books. So this is, I think, something that that was easily communicated to the rest of the country. Everybody understands what just happened there. It will have a direct impact on the number of arrests taking place previously under that section across the country. But there were a couple of more subtle things that the judgment did. One of which is that previously under the IT Act, third-party notices usually resulted in takedown of content in India. And so this meant that I could literally write to a major internet platform and say that I consider some form of content violative of my rights, and then they would do the usual, they don't want to combat it too much, too many resources expended that way, and so whether I had a good reason or not, the platform would usually choose to take down the content. This is not typical, this is not exclusive to India. Several countries have this problem. So this process was challenged before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court recognized that it is also problematic. And so now it's not possible for individuals to send direct notices to companies and expect a takedown. They will need to obtain a court order if they wish to take down content, which is again a significant victory. The third one, which you asked me about, Daniel, is the one that I don't think has quite sunk in, even though it's within the judgment. That relates to government blocking of content online. So the Supreme Court took a look at what we call the blocking rules in India, the process through which the government blocks online content. And what they say in the judgment is that they think that the blocking rules are fine and that they don't see any need to alter them. But when in the process of saying so, the Supreme Court articulates its own reading of the blocking rules. And that actually amounts to an interpretation that is pretty significant if you consider what the government had been doing in the past. So one of the things that the blocking rules said was that when the government is attempting to block a particular piece of content, it's usually the platform or the internet, the intermediary that is basically, they have to make reasonable attempts to contact the intermediary. And so previously, no efforts were made at all to contact the content originator. The Supreme Court has read the rules to mean that the government has to make reasonable attempts to contact the content originator. And this is something that nobody has tested yet. This might mean, in theory, that a reasonable attempt, for example, might involve a splash page to let the content originator know that that content has been blocked so that they can avail of their right to a hearing, which was the Supreme Court's basis for not touching the rules. And so I think we'll see a lot of more interesting litigation about this in the next couple of years. And I look forward to seeing how that goes.
I'd also like to ask you about another big issue in India, net neutrality, and specifically zero rating. And there are different efforts to get more people connected online. Can you tell us your sense of where this debate is headed?
Yeah, I'm not sure how it will end. What I can help you with is the two sides that are taking place. I'm sure that several of you read the New York Times article on free basics and the debate in India specifically. So it's been very interesting to us as we wrote the report to observe the amount of impact that the online activism has had in this context. And so separate from the issue itself, there is the fact that the internet was used to mobilize a lot of people and to get them to participate in a government consultation, to get them to understand something as complicated as net neutrality. I thought that was really effective. I think as far as basic net neutrality is concerned, the government has made it clear that they're committed to net neutrality, and so what remains is whether zero rating is going to be covered or not. As you all know, free basics has been at the center of this debate. I don't know whether this is whether fairly or unfairly. So it's basically people are, I guess that the two questions that are almost at opposition to each other is that do we prioritize quick access to everyone, access to the internet, or is it necessary to make sure that everyone has access to the full diversity of content provided by the internet? This is something that some people argue that you have to provide people with some access is better than no access. And other people argue that, well, controlling the information sphere in any way can be dangerous, because of its political implications. And also that it might lower the threshold of what we aim for when we're attempting to provide access to people. It's important to also note that in this context, the government of India has set aside a huge amount of money for the Digital India program, and they aim to bring most of India online through broadband connectivity. They've said they'll use balloons, drones, whatever it takes to get all of India online. And so I think that a lot of people also worry that that something like this may potentially lower what the government of India is aiming for in terms of general connectivity.
I'd like to turn to our experts on Hangout and actually start with Grace Gitaiga from Kenya, if we have her on the line. Now. Pardon, Grace, if you can hear us, can you unmute your microphone? If not, we can actually, no. Okay, well, we'll start then. We'll go to Tatiana Lokot in Ukraine. And Tanya authored the Ukraine country report for Freedom on the Net. She's also contributing editor of RUNET Echo, and so follows internet issues in Russia very closely. Tanya, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to start by asking you about Ukraine and specifically the ramifications of the conflict in eastern Ukraine. How has that affected internet freedom?
Well, it's definitely affected it negatively. As you can see, the score for Ukraine has dropped. So what we're seeing right now is that the pro-Russian forces, the pro-Russian and Russian side of the conflict, was very much in favor of the sort of direct application of physical force. So what they mostly engaged in is, either putting pressure on ISPs to block Ukrainian websites or pro-Ukrainian websites, and also intimidating online users, bloggers, journalists. So we've had several examples during the last year where journalists spent multiple months in the prisons, in the cellar, as it is colloquially known in eastern Ukraine, and for just sort of being called a Euromaidan supporter and not without any real proof. So people are basically suffering for what they write online. But I have to say that that doesn't mean that the Ukrainian government, the post-Euromaidan government, has not done anything, anything wrong. So they've obviously been trying to mostly sort of be reactive towards what Russia and the pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine have been doing. And in many ways, some of their reactions have really been overreactions. So just to give you an example, in April of this year, the Ukrainian law enforcement came to one of the largest Ukrainian hosting providers and accused them of hosting, I think, 4 or 5 what they called separatist websites, and basically took all their servers physically out of the building, which meant that 30,000 websites that the company was hosting were all down for for at least a few days, if not more. And it turned out that the company wasn't actually hosting them; it was just providing them with domains as a registrar, and they were actually hosted in Russia, those suspicious websites. But the fact is that the Ukrainian government has really been overreacting, and they haven't been showing their best side in this conflict.
Right. I'd also like to ask you about Russia, and as we heard from Gadi earlier, it has been, let's say, catching up and now moving ahead and increasing its censorship. Can you give us a sense of kind of what content is now being censored that was allowed maybe a year or two ago? How is this sort of seen in the online sphere?
Well, I mean, I think one of the lines that's been drawn very clearly is sort of anything that is very overtly either in support of Ukraine or it's sort of is kind of separatist toned, but separatist inside Russia. So Russia is all for separatism inside Ukraine, but they definitely consider any separatist, even if it's kind of as a joke, any separatist content that deals with separatism inside Russia, that's considered extremist. And people have been taken to court, people have been jailed, arrested, fined for posting like calls to rallies, somewhere in Siberia, even though they, of course, probably weren't really campaigning for Siberia separating from Russia. So that's one thing. I think the other thing is just the very notion of what is considered extremist has been broadened, and at the same time, it's become much more vague. And that's one of the issues that we observe with just the law on extremism, which is now, can deal with any religious matters, anything that looks like it's being overly critical of the heads of state, so Putin or Medvedev. And also the idea that, the more vague, the better. It's actually kind of the general trend with Russian legislation as it pertains to the internet and internet freedom. Some of the other more recent laws, such as the law on data localization that is mentioned in the Russia report, it's very vague because, it talks about personal data of Russian users, but it does not provide any good definition of what personal data actually is or who Russian users are. Are they people with Russian IPs? Are they people with Russian names? So there's a lot of vagueness, and most of the experts say that vagueness is deliberate because it allows the government to exploit the laws to apply them selectively when they need them.
And do you have any sense on how domestic and international companies are responding? Are they just are they using the vagueness as a way to do what they want, or are they worried that it will be used against them and so they will comply?
Well, it looks like it's sort of 50-50 because some companies have actually moved their servers hosting Russian user data to Russia. So the most recent example is Viber, who just a couple of weeks ago announced that they were moving their Russian servers to Russia to host user data there. And then other companies like Twitter or Facebook or Google, have kind of been able to negotiate their way around it somehow, because with Twitter, for instance, the Russian Internet and Media Watchdog Roskomnadzor actually said that we don't consider the data that Twitter collects on Russian users to be personal data. So Twitter is not a problem with this law. And it's, that again is an example of how some companies, maybe because of their business weight or, because of their business interests in the country, manage to get away with not complying with the law. But then other companies who can't exert the same power, so to say, actually have to comply. And because they don't know what personal data is, it's basically taken on a case-by-case basis. And that's what Russian regulators are doing. They're basically inspecting companies. They said they think they were going to inspect like almost, I think, over 100 companies by the end of this year to decide on a case-by-case basis whether they should be complying with this law or not.
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us from Kiev. A reminder, we will be collecting questions by note card, so if, I don't know if we pass them around or just raise your hand and a colleague will collect them. Do we have Tanya on the line? Sorry, Grace. Grace, are you able to hear us? Grace, could you unmute your... Grace, could you take your mute off? Okay, well, we'll try to come back later. I'd like to, I don't know if Gadi or Sonia could talk about the safe harbor issue. And one of the big issues that's got attention here was the European Court ruling earlier this month, which struck down the international agreement that allowed the transfer of digital information between the EU and the US. And the European Court was saying that this was a way that US intelligence could easily access the personal data of Europeans, so it would be that Europeans needed stronger privacy protections. Be interested in your reaction, sort of the implications, and I gather there's some uncertainty on what exactly this means and where it's headed.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at it from the Chinese perspective. Of course, they're pushing a whole different model of global governance, and I think any developments, including on any sort of setbacks on safe harbor, but also the right to be forgotten. These kinds of developments that are in the direction of less internet freedom are, play right into China's hands and into its discourse on the global internet. And I think we're already seeing a balkanized internet, as we can see from the map. But China's pushing that further. I don't know exactly how successful it will be, but you've seen that Lu Wei, who runs the internet kind of bureaucracy in China, has already tried to exercise leverage. He's brought all the internet companies around the world to China for a global internet conference. When Xi Jinping went to Seattle, of course, all the American tech companies came and paid homage. And when Lu Wei went to Silicon Valley, he ends up in Mark Zuckerberg's office, and a copy of Xi Jinping's page-turner, Governance in China, is on his desk, and Zuckerberg is recommending it to all his employees. So we see, China is pushing its vision of global internet governance. That if it has its way in terms of any sort of international discussions on standards, means that this trend that we see on Freedom House documenting is going to keep getting worse.
But is the message really a global message, or is it China saying, if you want access to our market, it's entirely on our terms, or is it we want international acceptance of this as the norm and other countries should do the same as us?
It's a combination of both, because the second serves their interest in the first. The more globally free the internet is, the more of a challenge that is to China's own conception of internet governance, both technically but also philosophically. So if you have the rest of the world going in a different direction, it becomes all that much more difficult for China to justify its approach to the internet. Currently, things are not going in that direction. I think they're quite happy with that. So to some extent, they just may be it's a blocking mechanism for internet governance not to go in a direction they don't want. But it is to serve that primary function, which is to say, you have to follow our rules, and you're not going to mess with how we govern our internet.
Right. And this is probably a bit of a million-dollar question, but are there ways for international companies to access the Chinese market without becoming entirely complicit in that?
It's a very interesting question in the Google building. Here we are. Obviously, as Google found out, to actually set up your services inside China, it's basically completely impossible to do business there that way without running into Chinese model of governance, and you're subject to their subpoenas, to their laws. Yahoo, of course, found that out, much to its dismay, a much longer time ago, by having to turn over the identity of people using their email, which led to people going to jail, several people going to jail. And the companies have learned this lesson. So some refuse to base their content, base their servers there, and that just means they have to provide less service. I mean, they can sort of get in through the Great Firewall. But I mean, LinkedIn is in there. It's essentially just a Rolodex, so maybe it's not as much of an issue for them. But to the extent they're still censoring shared content, and they just get less attention for it.
And I would just add regarding Safe Harbor that my personal fear is that it's really going to be the impetus for many countries to start passing data localization laws, and that is something that we have took notice of last year, where we have seen a number of proposals around the world to that extent. So when it comes to the relations and the things that will play out in the European Union, I think it will be interesting to ask here company representatives how they see that. But as I said, to me, the greatest concern is how this is going to be then reflected in other countries where rule of law is not present and where the government really has different intentions behind a closed door. As I mentioned, another European Court of Justice ruling, the right to be forgotten, and the implications it has had already in places like Russia, I do think that that's worth noting.
Actually, interesting and relevant question from the audience, and I'd also like Eileen's view on this is, are there ways to strengthen internet freedom through international agreements, whether we're talking bilaterally, an updated version of the US-EU Safe Harbor, but also thinking more broadly using international standards, the UN Human Rights Council, and so on?
So there, I would say that we have this general agreement that human rights are supposed to apply online as offline, and that actually came from a Human Rights Council resolution led by Sweden in 2012 that laid down that foundational concept. The problem is that we do not know how to do that, and we don't have good articulation of what is required to implement in practice respect for the rule of law and human rights in the online space with respect to various kinds of activities, whether it be surveillance or legitimate restrictions on content, et cetera. And so I think there's a lot of work that has to be done there. The other thing that I would mention is that everyone should be cognizant of the fact that there's kind of fragmentation happening on two important different dimensions on the net in the name of national sovereignty, internet sovereignty, some of which is in the Chinese model, and as Sanja just pointed out, some of which is intended to be protective of citizens in a human rights vein, data protection, et cetera, but is also having this fragmenting effect. And so one dimension is on the sort of technical proposals that affect physical layout and architecture or the protocol layer. And that will fragment the open interoperable platform, obviously very negative consequences for human rights. The second type of fragmentation is on the internet, activity on the internet, and that is more about respect for the rule of law and the human rights framework in the online context with respect to political speech, social activity, cultural affairs. Both of those kinds of fragmentation are really deleterious for the human rights framework, and people should be aware of both.
Right. I want to raise a question from Rebecca McKinnon and also give you a plug for the Ranking Digital Rights, which I guess is coming out in a week at Tuesday, and presenting also at the IGF. And obviously this is an effort to assess how companies handle human rights issues. And I gather part of the challenge is just getting information, including from government. So interesting to hear from Chinmay and Sonia as well in the research process, how, what are the challenges of getting the kind of information you need to make these assessments, and what would you push, in what ways would you push governments to be more transparent? What kind of information would you like to get more from them?
Thank you for the question. This is actually something that I almost always say while introducing our report, is that it is very difficult to get accurate information for this report. With government blocking, we actually have a rule that says that the blocking orders have to be kept confidential. And so the only way to figure out how many URLs have been blocked in a particular year is to get a member of parliament to ask a question in parliament, and then it has to be answered. And so if that doesn't happen, there's really no way. People have tried freedom of information requests, but they usually cite an exception and they don't give us the information. We've been discussing this with government. They have concerns, of course, about specific lists of URLs, but we've been telling them that some degree of transparency, at least in terms of numbers and categories, would only make people trust the process better. With companies also, as I think, and I'm so glad that Rebecca's project has finally taken off, we all know that they have varying degrees of transparency about the amount of content that they take down, that they block, and interception requests that they honor. I also think that there are other categories that they don't even discuss in the transparency reports, like proactive blocking. These are not third-party requests, and given the size of these platforms, I'd be very interested in, I think that both governments and companies need to observe an equal degree of transparency and due process.
And I would just add to that, for freedom on the net, I think there are different ways how our researchers have looked at typical censorship through blocking and filtering or through takedown requests. And some researchers will use mechanisms within their own countries, such as Chinmay, trying to ask members of parliament so they would get those official numbers. Other test availability of websites themselves. People talk to representatives from the private companies within the country. And I think when it comes to the censorship side, it is easier. When it comes to the surveillance side, I would say that that's the most difficult part about doing our job. Because regardless of how many interviews we do, government officials, of course, are not going to admit to the government's doing. We also talk to the private sector very often. Their employees are willing to talk to us unofficially. So we're able to get some sense through those ways. Our researchers also come through government budgets, for example, and they see how much money goes for certain programs. So they try to draw conclusions from that. There's also technical evidence, just looking at some cyber forensic evidence, particularly as it comes through activists and activists who are being surveilled, particularly through different means like malware. But again, the bottom line is that it's extremely difficult, and I think that as a researcher, there is nothing that I would like to have more is more transparent process through which we could turn and obtain that information.
Yes. So I gather Grace is online. She had some communications or connection issues. Third time's the charm. Grace, can you hear us, and can you take your mic off or turn it on? Oh, terrific. Welcome. So Grace Gitaiga is the author of the Kenya report for Freedom on the Net, and she's also with Kenya ACT Action Network. Grace, Kenya is a relative success story, a free country, rated free for internet freedom in Africa. And I'd be interested in how Kenyans see the importance of internet freedom and not just expanding access as important for the country's economic development.
That's obviously that's a
Sorry. No, connection isn't working. No, I'm very sorry. I think this isn't working. Okay. Wanted to move to another question from the audience, and Eileen, this touches on one of the points you made at the beginning about the human rights framework and how companies have a larger role to play. In addition to, it's not anymore just about governments and citizens. Companies, and especially in the online sphere, have a large role to play. What do you think they should, what responsibilities should companies have for internet freedom?
Well, they already do. There are voluntary principles that are applicable, the so-called Ruggie principles, and to respect and protect human rights. But I still do not think that companies fully appreciate how significantly their power and responsibility has increased in this digital context. Trans-border communication and data flow has become the norm, not the exception. And that I think this has presented a lot of challenges for both governments and for companies. Because in the traditional human rights framework, as I said earlier, the obligation primarily rests with states, and it is with respect to citizens in their own territory and jurisdiction. That's the normal understanding. And yet, with trans-border data flow that is actually affected and controlled by companies, the enjoyment of human rights of citizens in one country are now affected by governments and companies in other places. And I think that's the space that has to be looked at. I think there's also increasing complexity on jurisdictional questions, conflict of law issues about where the data is, who has access to it, for what purpose. And this is where we need to develop a rule of law, not just a rule by law understanding of what is required from a human rights point of view. Just because a law has been passed and a law is in place doesn't make it legitimate. It has to be for a legitimate purpose, and it can't fundamentally undermine free expression or other human rights. And so I think looking at that trans-border nature of digital communications is going to be the name of the game going forward.
Mm-hmm. Gotti, do you have thoughts on this question? What role and responsibility companies have for respecting human rights?
Well, I mean, we've gone over the conundrum that companies face to enter the Chinese market, and I would say that all of the companies in Silicon Valley are kind of examining what way can they get in if they haven't already tried, as Google did. And we're probably going to see, I mean, obviously, clearly Mark Zuckerberg is extremely interested in getting Facebook into China, and he's willing, it seems that he'll be willing to do whatever he can to make a Facebook China or some sort of different service. And I think they've answered that question. People like him have maybe answered that question for themselves, that they're willing to comply with Chinese laws and the Chinese way of managing the internet because they want to get into that market. So in the sense, I mean, Rebecca will know better on the ground about what their kind of rhetoric is these days on this front. But I think it's a very difficult choice that they face. They either decide that they're going to offer services within China and comply with Chinese laws, or to decide they're going to maintain these values globally and only deliver whatever they can to China over the Great Firewall. And the latter strategy is going to be less remunerative for them, and some companies will do that. So it's, I mean, they obviously are aware that they face difficult challenges based on the Google experience, the Yahoo experience. So I think there's not really any hidden challenge there. It's, the choice is quite stark.
Right.
That it also depends on the business model of each of these companies, because many of the tech companies are built on the business model that depends on the trust of their customers, of their clients. So then if they need to go in the country which requires things like China requires or what Russia requires, I think that business model crumbles. So then it becomes in their interest to preserve human rights, to preserve privacy.
Right. I wanted to do a final round, any final thoughts, but also put to you the totally unfair question of where you think the online space is headed. On the one hand, data is moving across borders even more quickly. It's hard to pin down, and yet governments are looking for the back doors and to pin down that data within their country and control it in surveillance. Which side do you think is getting ahead? Eileen.
So closing thought, I think one subject we haven't touched on is the fact that of the 7 billion people on the planet, only 3 billion are connected. So this conversation is about less than half of the population on the globe. So we can never forget the priority we have to place on getting the other 4 billion connected in a secure way. And that's a really important part of the equation. The second thing I would highlight is that this is the optimistic piece of the equation. I think there's a real opportunity for new alliances in the space of digital security. And I think that there's a recognition that digital security is now the heart of national security. It's the heart of international peace and security, preventing cyber war, and then in national security, protecting critical infrastructure. It's also in the interest of the private sector or those who are responsible for protecting, let's say, health data or confidential financial records or proprietary information. And then it happens to also be the heart of the human rights movement. Digital security for activists is the name of the game. And so I think there's a real potential for a new alignment of all of those players sharing this focus on digital security. And I think if that comes to be, that helps us move in a positive direction.
Yeah. Gotti?
I guess I'm pessimistic in the near term. We see where the trends are going right now, and more optimistic in the very long run, but it could be quite a long run. In the near term, China itself is becoming much more aggressive. Using the same kind of precepts, but doing much more with their capabilities, and that includes, of course, blocking Gmail and also arresting, I think, a broader segment of online activists, people who independently comment on whatever it is, corruption or ethnic policy. And we saw the life sentence, of course, for Ilham Tohti, who ran a website which essentially was just talking about Uyghur issues. And you have also trying to shut down people who are coming up with their own circumvention tools. So they're becoming more aggressive, and I think people who look to China as a model will try and kind of pattern themselves more after that. And then, of course, there's the fact that it is, as I mentioned earlier, easy to just kind of buy censorship and filtering off the shelf and open the box, and you can have the internet and already have blocking. Why I'm more optimistic long-term is I think it is difficult it will be difficult for many authoritarian states to have the capacity to maintain that in the face of advancing technological solutions and increased sharing. I think overall, I think the internet will become more free in the very long run. And so I'm optimistic.
Chinmay?
I'm going to begin with something controversial, I'm afraid. We've all been blaming China for a lot of that blue on the map. But I also think that it has a lot to do with how one of the most credible countries in this debate got exposed completely for its international surveillance. I think that was the flipping point that made it very difficult for human rights people to argue with governments when they said that, data localization is a good idea because look at what the United States is doing with your data. And so I think that the lesson in that is that it is very important for countries with some credibility to work really hard to maintain that credibility. And the same goes for all of the companies that are based in these countries. That's one. Two is an issue that I don't think that we discussed so much today, which is that we've been discussing the internet within this very libertarian framework, but actually the Freedom on the Net report covers third-party violation of rights, attacks on users by non-governmental actors. And I think that it's important to highlight that violence against women online has become a serious problem, and it's only increasing. And in the context of both of these things, I think that it's important for both governments and companies to start working very closely with human rights people, even when you're rolling out things like, free basics. Sometimes it is a good idea to involve different stakeholders in the debate just to make sure that everyone's priorities are covered in the beginning. And I look forward to seeing more of that.
I will also add to what Eileen was talking about. We still have much to go to bring people on the internet. Billions of people are still not connected. Many of them are in countries that currently have very low penetration rates. They are developing countries. And in many of those places, governments still have not really decided how they're going to deal with the internet. It is those countries very often that are still in the yellow category. They're partly free, but they're still looking at the Chinese model, and they're looking at the Western model, and they're trying to really figure out what they're going to do once their user population reaches a certain level of internet use. So I think it's important that we as an international community really focus on those countries. They're still trying to decide which path to take. And as I said, many of these countries are in developing world, and they're going to be affected the most with some of these emerging internet policies. One of the things that I find surprising is that even the donor community very often does not focus on countries until there is a problem there. But when I look at Africa, for example, in many of those states, we really don't have such horrible issues happening like in China, in Thailand, in Russia. But potentially bad things are going to happen there in 4, 5, or 6 years unless we empower civil society there to be the watchdog, unless we really educate online media to track these issues, and unless we really talk to those governments and provide the viable model and arguments in terms of why they should preserve the internet as open and free.
Well, thank you all for a very stimulating discussion. Eileen Donahoe, Gadi Epstein, Chenmai Arun, and Sonia Kelly, and thank you all for coming this morning.